It's the biggest scandal to hit the United Nations in years. A new report says there were 99 allegations of sexual misconduct by UN staff last year. So what is being done to stop it, and are the victims being looked after? This is Inside Story. Hello and a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has called sexual abuse by UN peacekeepers a cancer in our system. Yet the number of complaints continues to grow. A new report catalogues allegations against UN staff from 21 different countries. Few are ever brought to justice because peacekeepers are immune from prosecution in the countries they are deployed in. We'll look at why this is so in just a moment, but first, Al Jazeera's Osama bin Javed has this report.
United Nations peacekeepers were supposed to come to the rescue in Central African Republic. Instead, they've been accused of sexual exploitation. A new UN report says the number of allegations of sexual exploitation or abuse against its staff reached 99 last year, compared with 80 the year before. In a statement, it says this regrettably marks an increase in the number of new allegations, signifying that more needs to be done to reduce the number of allegations and, more importantly, the number of victims affected by sexual exploitation and abuse perpetrated by United Nations personnel. The report further names all 21 countries whose nationals are allegedly involved in sexual abuse. The United Nations has been criticized for not doing enough, prompting the Secretary-General to speak out on the issue last year.
I believe the disturbing number of allegations we have seen in many countries, but particularly in the Central African Republic, in the period before UN peacekeepers were deployed and since, speaks to the need to take action now. Enough is enough.
It was in 2014 that allegations of wrongdoing in the Central African Republic first came to light, when French troops were accused of sexual misconduct. The mission is made up of more than 10,000 personnel from more than 45 countries. And the UN says it takes time to investigate such accusations. But sexual abuse by UN personnel is not new. UN soldiers in Haiti were found to have sex in exchange for food and medicine. In 2003, the then Secretary-General Kofi Annan promised swift action and a policy of zero tolerance. The most recent report calls for the establishment of an on-site court-martial proceeding when allegations amount to sex crimes, and calls on member states to obtain DNA samples of alleged perpetrators. But so far, it doesn't seem to be working. Reports from Central African Republic say women and girls are raising babies who are the alleged children of UN troops. Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera.
Let's now bring in our guests for today's discussion. In Washington, D.C., Seth Ahn, legal advisor to the Code Blue campaign that aims to end immunity for sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeeping personnel. In Dublin, via Skype, we have Ryan McCarroll, author of the article, The United Nations and Sexual Abuse. And in Dakar, also on Skype, Stephen Coburn, Deputy Regional Director of West and Central Africa at Amnesty International. Welcome to all of you. Seth, if I could just start with you and a look at the nature of the allegations that we've got here on the table. What abuse exactly are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about sexual abuse and exploitation, but it's rape. It's oftentimes it's statutory rape of children, which sometimes the UN describes as sexual exploitation, as sex for food, but let's be clear, if they're children, it's rape. And then there's also exploitation of adult women in terms of trading sex for food, in terms of prostitution, and it's widespread.
Stephen, how do these abuses take place? I'm wondering how it is that you have a peacekeeping team of men in blue helmets in UN vehicles approach a camp of displaced people, mainly women and children, and they manage to lure women and children into areas where these abuses can take place. Why is this allowed to happen?
Certainly what we see in Central African Republic, like we see it around the world, you have a context where the rule of law has broken down. You have a context where civilians, especially women and children, are vulnerable to different armed groups, but of course are also vulnerable to UN peacekeepers. And you've got a massive, massive imbalance of power between people who are forced to leave their home and are vulnerable and are desperate, and then you have soldiers who of course have power and they have access to resources and they have the ability to exploit that power if the right checks and balances and the right systems are not there in place. And I think we've seen a mix of reasons why that's happening, a chaotic context, but also real problems in the terms of the quality and the troops that have been deployed, and probably as much as anything, the lack of accountability that exists for when crimes take place.
So those factors that you mentioned, Stephen, do they contribute sort of a perfect storm almost? If we take, for example, Central African Republic, where almost a third of these allegations are said to have taken place.
Absolutely. I mean, Central African Republic is a context where a lot of these conditions come together, where you had a conflict that killed over 5,000 people. There were almost 1 million people displaced from their homes. Many people are living in makeshift camps. And a deployment of peacekeeping forces that is trying to, overall trying to keep some stability, but it's put in a position where they can exploit their position. And what you had in this case is that you've got a number of countries, a number of troops deployed to this specific peacekeeping mission that probably were not up to UN standards in terms of their training and their vetting and their quality, and have stayed there for 2 years. And that all these problems have built up, and unfortunately the civilian population has been left exposed to small numbers but important numbers of peacekeeping troops who've chosen to exploit their power.
Ryan, if we look at the perpetrators for a moment... I'm sorry, Steph, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just going to interject. I don't think there's anything unique about Central Africa. I think he's right that it's a perfect storm, but I think that it's not a coincidence that increased attention in Central Africa has led to more allegations. I think if we paid the same scrutiny to other peacekeeping missions, I think we'd see similar increases in allegations.
Seth, where do you think exactly?
I think Haiti has been an example, but I don't think there's a limit. I think that because of this sense of impunity, I think that peacekeeping missions around the world are going to see these types of allegations. We've seen them in the past, and it's not just military. I think that often gets overlooked. Until this year, the number of non-military UN personnel who were accused of sexual abuse, the allegations against them were basically about equal, in some cases more than military. The UN is quick to pass it off as a troop-contributing country issue, but there's also a dramatic number of people in the UN who are being accused of these crimes as well.
Ryan, we've got 99 cases in this particular report. Would you agree that there are probably many more incidents within the UN of sexual abuse?
Yeah, I think that's probably quite obvious, actually. And what I would say, in fact, is what I think that we see is that there are so many contributing nations now that are contributing under the UN banners, right, or at least to a UN-mandated mission, but they might not have had any training, they might not have any supervision or any real significant resources to combat sexual abuse prior to deployment. So what you have is the UN sort of catching up, right? So, for example, you have the African Union sending peacekeeping troops to Central African Republic without having any prior training on sexual abuse. You have Georgia sending troops to Central African Republic, and what you have is this sort of relationship between the UN and these other regional security institutions like the African Union or EUFOR, and there's no guarantee that those soldiers prior to deployment are receiving any sort of training. And it's also not clear that the UN reforms, which have been instituted mostly since 2005, are affecting those troop-contributing countries.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Stephen, I want to pick up on that, because if you look, for example, at the DRC, the whole contingent in the DRC from the Central African Republic was sent home. I mean, the UN official who was stationed in Bangui said that it inherited troops who one cannot call troops. What was sent here was trash. I mean, should these contributing countries be better screening the men that they send abroad as peacekeepers?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really important role for the troop contributing country and also the UN to make sure that the troops are deployed do meet minimum standards, and certainly in terms of human rights and sexual exploitation and abuse. And that clearly has not been done in CAR. So the UN mission inherited a mission from the African Union that included troops from the DRC, from Congo Brazzaville and elsewhere, that ended up proving to be quite problematic, and so which of course led to those troops from the DRC being sent back, and another 120 from the Republic of Congo being kept in their barracks recently whilst under investigation for abuse. So in this case, it's clearly not been the right vetting, and of course what we would hope is that there's been better vetting for those forces that have joined more recently, but I don't think we could be confident that those systems are all in place to make sure that's the case. And like one of the colleagues said before, CAR is a particularly bad case, but it's not unique, and it's not. These cases, of course, happen in many other places around the world, which don't necessarily share the same specific problems about inheriting an African Union mission.
So, Seth, the vetting systems may not be in place, but what about when these troops get sent home? What onus is on those troop-contributing countries to look at the men who've been accused of sexual abuse and prosecute them, bring them to justice?
Right. There's very little, excuse me, there's very little onus on the troop-contributing countries. We're just talking about various countries having poor training, but let's remember that France has been accused. French soldiers were accused in the Central African Republic of committing sexual abuse and violence. So France claims that they are investigating and examining what's happening, and we haven't seen any results yet. But there isn't anything that the UN has put in place that requires these troops, these countries prosecute the troops. Ban Ki-moon has said that he'll do a name and shame, where he'll actually name the countries, which they're describing as a very unique new innovation. But I don't think that's really going to get results. I think that they have to threaten to withhold payments for peacekeeping unless these countries actually prosecute. And back to the other point I was making, the UN has to ensure that its own personnel get prosecuted, whether it's with the host country or with their home country. If these non-military personnel aren't being tried, then the military is not going to have the incentive to suddenly push to try its own soldiers. Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I know you mentioned that point earlier, Seth. Ryan, what do you think about these non-military personnel not being named and shamed? I mean, they come from 30 countries, or 30 other UN staff have been accused from other countries, and they have not been put up on this website. So why are they getting special protection?
Yeah, look, I just need to make a few clarifying points, though, as well. So, for example, between 2007 and 2014, the United Nations was only able to get contributing countries to respond to allegations 45% of the time. Now, that doesn't even mean prosecution. That's just getting a response. So a recognition that there's been a report that has condemned or sort of accused, right? So one of the problems is that the UN has very little jurisdiction. It has very little control, obviously, in those, let's say, the Republic of Georgia or the Democratic Republic of Congo. So when something like this happens, considering they can barely even get a response from some of these countries some of the times, it's highly unlikely that they're going to result in a prosecution. Just to give a further example, in the most recent case in Central African Republic, when you have Georgian and French troops being accused, these allegations are from 2 years ago. So there's very little chance that that's going to actually result in a prosecution, no matter what sort of domestic investigations are undertaken in the Republic of Georgia or in France. And I would also add that there's also no guarantee that just because soldiers come from France that they're inherently more trained or better able or equipped to deal with sexual abuse, right? We shouldn't make that assumption. U4 absolutely has a responsibility here to address this issue. The UN can only do so much. There needs to be much better cooperation between U4, the UN, and the AU prior to deployment and during deployment. So if we could institute some sort of criminal court that can prosecute some of these allegations in the country before some of these soldiers are allowed to go home, and then who knows what's going to happen to them, then that would be a huge advancement.
Well, Stephen, that brings me on to this issue of this idea of an on-site court-martial proceeding, where, of course, troops in that country they've been deployed into could be subject to being held accountable in that country. Can you realistically ever see that taking place?
I mean, I think it's true that there'll be a lot of political barriers in the way of doing that. Of course, many countries are unwilling to see accountability for their own soldiers and to see their soldiers tried. That should not be the barrier to get justice in this case. The most important thing is that the victims see justice and that there is accountability and there are dissuasive measures for such acts in the future. And we need to find the right solutions. There are many different proposals on the table about how this could happen, whether it's our courts in the country itself, or whether there's an ability to find another mechanism if the troop contributing country is not willing to prosecute, or other hybrid type ideas that could be done. Whichever the solution is, the most important thing is that we find a way of ensuring justice and fair justice and accountability for these crimes, and that we don't allow countries to hide behind their immunity or hide behind the politics that is driving some of these decisions. This has been going on for too long. The UN has said that having zero tolerance for sexual exploitation is their priority, and they've been saying that for 10 years. And it's really time now that we take some practical actions to overcome that.
But of course, the big question is, Seth, would countries still be willing to provide troops if they knew that their troops could be prosecuted?
I think the answer is yes. We have on our Code Blue campaign that's fighting this impunity for peacekeepers, we have Romeo Dallaire, the former general from Rwanda, the Canadian general, on our advisory board. And he's confident that, yes, countries would still do it. The truth is, peacekeeping has become a money-making proposition for many countries. It's no longer primarily France or Belgium or Canada. It's countries that need the money. So I think there is leverage that the UN can use because these countries want to continue to get these funds to support their military.
Ryan, how much leverage do you think the UN actually has? I mean, there is this attitude of we can only do so much, we can only investigate and report to individual countries whose nationals commit crimes. I mean, is that a fair point? Is the UN, or does the UN have its hands tied in many cases?
Look, this is a very complicated issue. I think it's a very political issue in the sense that some troop contributing countries are doing it very much to gain international legitimacy. It's a status issue. If we look at the Republic of Georgia, for example, one of the main reasons why they're contributing to a EUFOR, that is a European force mission in Central African Republic to begin with, is because they're looking for international credibility in the lead up to trying to get NATO membership and eventual perhaps European Union membership. So there's a lot on the table for Georgia, right? And other countries as well in terms of status and legitimacy and other sort of geopolitical objectives that they might have. The problem I think that the UN has in particular is getting other countries that have different sort of asymmetrical relations, right? So for example, the United States, France, other countries that have less, let's say, at stake in terms of status and legitimacy in the international arena, right? So getting the more powerful countries actually to sign up to a loss of their sovereignty is going to be extremely difficult. And but that's not to say that we shouldn't try. We absolutely should. But I don't think that we should underestimate how difficult it would be, for example, for a country like the United States to sign up to allowing one of their soldiers to be prosecuted, for example, in a peacekeeping context.
Stephen, do you agree with that? I mean, I believe that the UN Secretary General is going to be taking this to the UN Security Council in about a week's time, trying to get a resolution to move some of these reforms through. Do you think we're actually going to see anything happen in New York?
I don't know what will happen in New York. I agree with the others. There'll be difficulties, but there's no excuse not to try, and we really need to push this forward. It's been far too long. I think we need to look at the consequences of not acting on this in a country like Central African Republic. These, of course, the consequences for the victims, but also for the credibility of the peacekeeping forces itself and what that means for the stability of the country. Now, if the population loses confidence in these peacekeeping forces, or if the international community loses confidence in the UN peacekeeping force there, and they withdraw, or their capacity is reduced or not strengthened, then the impact on the peace and stability of the country is huge. Because despite some of these horrendous allegations, the peacekeeping force, an effective peacekeeping force that respects human rights, is absolutely vital for the peace and stability and security of countries like Central African Republic.
Yeah, Seth, and it's imminent, isn't it? I mean, this is something that needs to be sorted out now in the Central African Republic, and yet it seems that whatever the Secretary-General or the UN tries to do, the problem persists. I mean, in 2014, French troops were accused of sexual misconduct. In August, the Secretary-General fired the head of peacekeeping. It sent the whole peacekeeping mission from the DRC away. It said enough is enough. And yet here we are with more allegations of 14-year-old girls bearing children of UN peacekeepers.
It does seem like more of the same. No, go ahead.
One of the things that I do want to highlight is that the United Nations is increasing its investigation capabilities. So I think to answer an earlier question, if we had better investigations or better information, would we expect more allegations? I think the answer is already in the pudding, right? So as more and more resources go into investigations, we're uncovering more and more allegations of sexual abuse. And so the connection, of course, to that is very clear, right? The more that we investigate, then the more allegations will come to light. So the issue then becomes on greater cooperation between interagencies, so between the United Nations and not just individual countries on a bilateral basis, but also between these units like the African Union and EUFOR, so that you have greater cooperation from prosecution training and all steps along the way prior to deployment. And I would also add that includes some sort of reform that will include greater participation of women in peacekeeping forces. It would include some type of reform that isn't just based off of prosecuting individuals, right? We know from historical fact that anytime you're just trying to prosecute individuals, you're not going to get the significant reform that's systemic that you need, right? So we need some sort of unit-wide or even security apparatus-wide, whether that's EUFOR, NATO, AU, whatever it might be, that's affecting everyone prior to and during deployment in some cases.
And just in the last few minutes that we've got left, let's not forget the victims in all of this. Seth, what help does the UN at this stage give girls, women and the families that they have?
My understanding is very little. I think they've claimed to give some psychosocial support, but as the incidents in Central Africa reveal, there's very little done. They were interviewing children who had been raped, and it took months until they responded and then criticized the person who responded by passing the report on to the French. I think more investigations by the UN clearly will reveal more allegations, but I think it goes further. I think that their response is slow, it's inadequate. I think that's why we've been advocating for some independent oversight, almost a receivership, putting the response to sexual exploitation and abuse into the hands of member states who create a board and can really react and respond quickly. There's no time for a year-long review. I think there needs to be immediate changes and that are really independent of the UN. As my colleague said, the zero tolerance has been around a long time, but it really hasn't gotten the UN anywhere.
Stephen, there is the UN Trust Fund to support so-called specialised services that are needed by victims of this abuse. What help do you know, being in that part of the world, is available?
Well, this trust fund exists. I couldn't tell you how well that's being used in CAR or elsewhere. I mean, what we can say is that some of those examples of the investigations, some of the children who had been abused by French forces received, very, very little support until the media, it became a big thing in the media, which was more than a year later. And so that was due to a lot because there was not a clear system or an obvious system about how those had been referred and investigated. There was a report done by a UN panel of experts in December, which talked about how these information was passed from inbox to inbox, desk to desk, because it wasn't clear, who was taking responsibility for this. And I think that's something that has to be sorted, and we have to make sure that the type of medical, psychosocial support and remedies are available for the victims in addition to accountability. Because at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the victims are put up front in this, are put up first, and they're our first consideration in everything we do. And I think that hasn't really happened to date.
A very interesting discussion indeed. Some really great points made there, and let's look to reforms being made and hope that they will indeed work. Thanks very much to all our guests for joining us here today. We have Seth Earn, Ryan McCarroll and Stephen Coburn. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.